Okay, so today we are moving squarely into the 18th century, into the time period known as the era of the Bourbon Reforms. This is a period of great change, much of it stemming from Spain. Throughout the class, you have heard me refer to this time period as a moment when a lot of things that we have described as being particular to the way that power and authority worked. In the early modern era in the Spanish Empire, but also in particular in colonial Latin America, the power of the church, the way that indigenous and Spanish societies were structured, ideally in separate ways, things having to do with the preservation and the extension and the learning of indigenous languages, things having to do with religious expression and cultural expression. I keep referring to all of these things as having developed throughout the 16th century, becoming more fully expressed in the 17th century. And I keep referring to all of these things um, as foreshadowing the way that they are going to change enormously in the 18th century. And as I've mentioned before, um, the new dynasty, the Bourbons, and the beginning of the reforms that this new dynasty brought did officially start right at the beginning of the 18th century, so right in 1700. But the real impact in terms of all of those aspects of colonial society and colonial structures really happened primarily in the second half of the 18th century. So today's lecture is going to actually probably be two lectures. Um, I'm going to break them up both because I don't have a lot of time to do this recording right now, and also so that you can listen to them in shorter bursts. But this, what is conceptualized right now is one lecture, and I'm going to be heavily relying on my notes, so I apologize for looking off screen. Um, I'm imagining as a kind of introduction and overview. And there is going to be another couple of lectures that focus more specifically on the impacts of these bourbon reforms and on a little bit more detail of certain aspects of them. So, but today I'm going to dive in here. Um, those of you who are in class with me, there's a PowerPoint that you can you can follow along with if you like. I'm not going to share my screen here though, because it's really not, it's not that important that you look at the PowerPoint. But for those of you who like to look at something that has bullet points, you are welcome to do so. It's up on Carmen. So the Bourbon dynasty comes to power at the very start of the 18th century. The long era of Habsburg rule, which is the dynasty that ruled throughout the 16th and 17th centuries and exhibited the kind of priorities that we have talked about, excuse me, so far, and ruled over Spain through an enormous time of great change, of rise, of fall. Um, that long era of Habsburg rule ended in 1700 when Charles II died without leaving an heir. He chose Prince Philip, who was a grandson of the French Bourbon monarch, to replace him, which would have linked France and Spain under one king. But powers on both sides opposed this alliance, and a war of succession broke out for about 14 years. So at the end of this war, there were treaties that established a number of things, and among them allowed the French Bourbon monarchs to retain the Spanish throne, but only as Spanish kings. So created a new, they had been French monarchs, and they didn't suddenly become Spanish in their worldviews or their, culture, etc. But they were now Spanish kings. They only had rule over Spain and Spain's um, territories. So these treaties stipulated that the two crowns be kept completely separate, and that Philip, who would now be Philip V of Spain, would give up all succession rights in France. So as a part of these treaties, also, Spain lost all of its European possessions. but retains its American ones. So now Spain is really struggling. It already, uh, went through a period of economic decline in the 17th century, but it is whittled far, far down from its glory days, far from an empire now, the kind of Holy Roman Empire that it enjoyed in the heights of its global reach. It is simply a country with a set of colonies in the Americas. It's war weary and financially drained. So the Americas become a crucial source of wealth in a way that they had not been before. So this new monarchical line attempts to change a great deal about Spain's relationship with its colonies. They're following French political models, a new Enlightenment style and philosophy of rule. Their watchwords are rational, effective, standard. They were interested in political reform, economic reform, and cultural reform as well. They wanted to modernize the colonies, and these were words that they themselves used. So, what did all this mean? The monarchs made efforts to streamline economic production and extraction, trying to stop contraband and benefit more from its colonies vis-a-vis other European powers. It tried to strengthen royal power in all kinds of ways, ways that ended up being very local in its reach, um, ended up changing the structure of colonial government in many instances, setting up new um, municipalities or new what's the word I'm looking for? New entities, new jurisdictions of colonial rule. It also reformed courts, particularly church courts. We'll talk more about that. A whole lot of different kinds of very wide-reaching and broad policies and reforms and restructuring of institutions and processes and practices, all meant to supposedly theoretically strengthen royal power at all levels of society, and on the big picture, and to regain local control from colonial elites, meaning American-born españoles, referred to often as criollos. So to reassert peninsulares control, and direct representation of Spain and royal authority. So to regain local control from colonial elites and to change the relationship between the church and the state, taking a whole host of powers that the church traditionally had away from the church and claiming them for the state. Now, remember that the church was really a part of the state. However, the Bourbons now are thinking still of the church as a part of the state, but as a reduced part of the state. The way that the church and the state were envisioned in terms of colonial rule in the 17th century was much more of a partnership. So that, yes, the church was under the control of the king officially, and yet it also had this other higher authority to God, but also to the Pope. And so there was a sense in which, mother church and father state or father crown were envisioned as in partnership, were metaphorically described as a family and as mother and father as a kind of partnership in rule in general and in colonial rule. But here we have the church reduced in a lot of its functions, in its political and economic functions, and put, squarely as a subordinate part of the church. So this isn't separation of church and state. In a sense, it's even more subordination and more involvement of the church in the state, but as a very limited department, a very limited expression of that power. So the state sought to control the church as a part of strengthening royal power, as a part of economic reforms, as a part of cultural reforms. It does set the stage for an eventual post independence separation of church and state, because what we have at that point is a church that it has finally defined itself in large part as a spiritual institution. But this right here is not that. This is changing the way that religion and politics are thought of together, but only just the beginning of it. Still understood that the church is a part of the state, but it is now a weaker part of the state. So the idea that religious um, teachings, the idea that spirituality, the idea that that sacraments, that you know, that the physical representations of the church and that church rituals are essential to political rule, are essential to colonial rule, still very much exists. But the state now is attempting to limit the church's ability to have a say in economic matters and in a number of kinds of political matters, and to a great degree in management of the population, except for in these, um, much more circumscribed ways. So I hope that that makes sense. I'm going to say quickly again, just briefly, the things that the monarchs are really trying to do in these Bourbon reforms: streamline economic production and extraction in order to stop contraband and to benefit more from its colonies in terms of getting more money and goods, but also benefit more vis-a-vis other competing European powers, which are taking goods and etc. through piracy and contraband. So streamline economic production and extraction, particularly by trying to stop, I didn't mean to do that, contraband. Two, to strengthen royal power, to regain local control from colonial elites, and for to change the relationship between the church and state by reducing the power of the state, and retaining those powers for this, uh, taking those, oh my gosh, I don't remember what I said. To change this relationship between the church and the state, taking a whole host of powers that the church traditionally had away from the church and claiming them for the parts of the state that exclude the church. Okay, these reforms begin almost as soon as the 18th century starts, but they're most intensive and systematic in the Americas after 1750 and for the last half of the 18th century. This midpoint of the 18th century is also when you start to see changes in the Baroque style of art, religiosity, music, cultural forms, etc. That does not mean that all of these forms disappear. And in fact, you can still see them even into the 19th century. But this is a time when you start to see different styles of sermons, different styles of music, different styles of poetry, different styles of art, different styles of architecture, etc., that are specifically related to the 18th century and actually express a lot of these ideals. So today is primarily about the actions of the Bourbon state, and then I will talk later in other lectures about other kinds of cultural changes underway in the late 18th century. So a few characteristics of the Bourbon state. First of all, when we talk about the Bourbons, we're not just talking about monarchs in Spain. We're talking about an enormous bureaucracy of administrators that the monarchs sent over, an army of bureaucrats. So we really can talk about Bourbons in the plural. And when we talk about the reconquest of the 18th century, when historians talk about that, in part what they mean is that there's this enormous flood of people, a new bunch of not just people like were happening in the 17th century. Remember, I was talking a lot about in the 17th century, how you have a whole lot more Spaniards coming over as kind of immigrants looking for opportunities, looking to build a new life. But these are people without education often. These are people who have struggled to make ends meet in Spain during the economic recession. And so you have a really different kind of Spaniard than were coming in the 16th century. But now you have um, Spaniards being sent by the crown who are officially there to take power and to make changes. So you really have a kind of colonial army of bureaucrats. Admin so when we talk about a reconquest, we don't mean a military reconquest, but we do mean a bureaucratic reconquest, an administrative reconquest. So Bourbons were always doing certain things in their reforms, whether these things were directed towards the church, popular culture, or local colonial government. They were forever framing comprehensive regulations and codes, writing new regulations, new codes, reframing old ones, saying again what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. They were a very paper heavy um, a bunch of reformers. So framing comprehensive regulations and codes, creating standard procedures, new rules, again, new guidelines, creating standard procedures all the time, passing moral judgment. They were always writing about how this was the kind of cleanliness is close to godliness is a way that I think about these guys. They were really into order, they were really into streamlining everything, but it wasn't just for economic efficiency, it wasn't just for political um, efficiency and efficacy. It was also, there was a sense that there was, the kind of sinful, moral degeneracy that had happened in the previous manifestation of colonial rule. And so there was a kind of moral judgment and superiority that went along with the way that they talked about creating order in all of these ways. They were always introducing new taxes and collection methods. And as a part of all of these things, actually cleaning up popular religious celebrations that they thought were excessive or unruly or a waste of time or a waste of money. Even though it might be the local town that was spending the money on these religious festivals, there was something offensive, there was something inefficient, there was something anti-modern from the perspective of the Bourbons about this. Carlos Fuentes is a Mexican intellectual, and he wrote a lot about the Bourbons, and he created this wonderful many-part series documentary about the Bourbon Reforms, and actually about all of the colonial period, but has a lot on the Bourbon Reforms in there. And he describes them as modernizing busybodies, and I think that's the perfect uh, description of them. It is important to keep in mind, however, that the Bourbons were not interested in a complete overturning of the past. They wanted to legitimize themselves by building on previous colonial claims. They cited Habsburg laws whenever possible to legitimize their efforts. They stressed continuity. They said that they were fulfilling the original purpose, fulfilling the original, bettering, improving the original colonial plan. Their goals were supposedly to make more effective, streamline, and rationalize the policies of the past. They were interested in reform, interested in additions, adding more policies and guidelines, etc., rather than subtractions for the most part. They were interested in adjustments, not complete overhaul. Spanish Bourbon administrators are more active and invasive rulers than the Habsburgs were. They were more inclined to follow orders from central authority than allow for interpretations of local interpretations of policies. So remember, the Habsburg way had been obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I do not comply. That suggested I am loyal to you. I am obeying your orders, but I can't comply with the specifics because I am here on the ground. And I know that you trust me to adjust to local conditions. That was the Habsburg understanding style of authority, not so much the Bourbons. The importance of the judge that I stressed over and over again in the 16th and 17th century, judicial power, this would give way to the importance of the governor. In other words, executive power. So executive power finally does strengthen in Latin America in the later 18th century when more and more and more power is handed to the governor as opposed to the local judges. There is an active vision fixed on the idea of reclaiming America, recovering power from what the Bourbons believed had become a too powerful colonial elite, American-born Creoles, Españoles, and following French models. Um, I'm gonna stop here and do a second or perhaps also a third uh, uh, part of this lecture.